So today we are honored to welcome Abilene's very own Marlin Fitzwater. As many of you already know, Marlin is an author, and he served as White House Press Secretary for Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush from 1983 to 1983 to 1993. I got stuck, Marlin. I got stuck on that decade.
So did I.
He was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal in 1992 and is the founder of the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication, located at Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire. It's such an honor to welcome Marlin back here to Abilene, where his play entitled Empire's Fall premieres at Great Plains Theater this Friday. So if you don't have your tickets, there's somebody in the audience that can help you with that too. We have everybody here today. Tomorrow, Marlin will receive the 2019 Alumni Excellence Award presented by the K-State Alumni Association. But today, we are pleased to hear about his new book entitled Calm Before the Storm. Please help me welcome Mr. Marlin Fitzwater.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm always delighted to be back in Abilene. I find myself saying many of the same words that Ike said 60 or 70 years ago about Abilene, so I won't repeat all those things, but it's a great honor for me to be back here. I know you've all heard my stories about once in high school I was hired to help plant the tulips in the tulip beds outside the library. And I didn't ever imagine I'd be at the microphone of this place. But in any case, it's been a long, colorful history between myself and the Eisenhower Library. I would just say, to begin, just a couple words that I first started this book a couple years ago, and I remembered reading one of Ike's last books called At Ease, Stories I Tell to Friends. And it was a great book, and he did about a page and a half on all of his friends. A page and a half on MacArthur and on Omar Bradley, on General Montgomery, on Winston Churchill. And I said, this is the kind of book I want to write. And I just want to talk about the great time I had in the White House, the great time I served with two presidents, and talk about my friends. So that's what I've done. And it's called Calm Before the Storm, because in the process of doing all this, I dug out an old diary that I kept during Operation Desert Storm and realized that it said a lot of different things that I had kind of forgotten, and that I thought there was some historic value in having actual words of the president and his top staff in making the decisions before going to war. I don't have any battle scenes in there. I don't count the number of tanks. I don't know anything about guns and trucks and all that kind of stuff. But I do have all the talks and deliberations and innermost thinkings of the president and his key staff, General Powell and others, during the 6 months period that led up to the war. So that's kind of the centerpiece. And I brought along a few slides. I'll try to rush through these. My wife is always telling me that I get bogged down in my own voice and don't do enough on the pictures. So here we go. Maybe here we go. There we go. There's the two gentlemen I worked for 10 years. And I would just say now, as I always say, they are the greatest men in the world. They were then and they are now, and I am so proud of every day I spent with them. You'll see that reflected in the pictures. This was the first day of Operation Desert Storm, really was the day Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And by coincidence, I was here in Abilene, Kansas, visiting my mom and dad, who were both alive at that time. And I got a phone call on about the second day that said, Saddam has invaded Kuwait. The president has already acted to cut off all their money and close their bank accounts and everything in the United States. And he is consulting with the Allies at this moment, and he wants you back in Washington immediately. I said, okay, I'll be on the next plane. I don't know where I was going to get a plane here in Abilene, but I assumed there was something around, and there was. I said, where's the president right now? And they said, he's in Aspen, Colorado, or on his way to meet with Margaret Thatcher, who was at the Aspen Institute. I said, fine, I'll meet him there. And hung up and got an airplane to Aspen, and I beat him there, actually, by about an hour. And that was the beginning of my consultations and work with the president on Desert Storm. This is a picture in the local chalet that we met her in. And you can see, to orient yourself, the president and Margaret Thatcher there in the middle, and his staff all around him. And that's me, the bald guy with glasses there in the far corner. I had a little hair then, so I'm so happy to see these pictures whenever I get a chance. This is outside the chalet when the two of them met the press. I'm standing there in the hat behind them, and that's when they both made it pretty clear that America and England were going to stand together and try to force Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. The next picture, as we go in the lodge, President Bush was always on that telephone. He had a lot of background in foreign policy, and he doesn't hesitate a minute to start calling all the people involved. And this is, he had, his first call went to King Fahd in Saudi Arabia, who's, both Bush and Margaret Thatcher believed that Hussein wanted to get into Saudi Arabia and get at their oil fields. And they thought he was going there next. And basically they said, we've got to draw a line in the sand, if you will, and let him know that he's not going into Kuwait into Saudi Arabia without facing the wrath of the United States and Great Britain. And so this is him talking to King Fahd. I always enjoy this picture because the cord wasn't long enough for him to take the phone, so he had to lean down on the bed to make his call. I could just picture King Fahd in Saudi Arabia and the other phone sitting in a gold throne with a crown on, thinking, who is this sleepy guy who's calling me up here? Anyway, that was the beginning. This is 3 days later after consultations with his military and National Security Council and a lot of other people. And we were at Camp David for meetings, flew back to the White House in a helicopter, landed on the South grounds. He walked over to the press corps. Their first question was, what are you going to do about Kuwait? And President Bush says, this will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. And Colin Powell was standing next to me, and he looks down and smiles, and I said, well, what is that all about? And Colin says, he just declared war, Marlin, get ready. And indeed that was. From that point on, there was no question but that we were on a war footing and what we were going to do. I'd like to include this picture only because this is the president's private quarters in the residence above the public quarters, which you see on TV. And there are pictures hardly ever shown of the family quarters, and certainly not of his office. But this is one of the first meetings with myself. And the other gentleman there is Bob Gates, who you may recall as he was National Security Advisor. At this point, he later became director of the CIA for 4 or 5 years, and then became Secretary of Defense under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So this was the beginning of an illustrious career for him. But that's where a lot of the discussions went on about what we were going to do and say related to the war. This is a similar photo. We spent a lot of the first couple months at Kennebunkport, Maine, which is President Bush's summer home. You can see through the windows there out onto the ocean. It's a beautiful sight, and the two men in the middle again are Secretary of State James Baker and Bob Gates again, and myself. And Bush is on the phone. He was always on the phone. And but that's how we conducted a lot of the meetings and a lot of the planning sessions for the war. This is the day before the invasion. I like this picture only because it shows the intensity of the President and the Secretary of State going to a final meeting, and they know that tomorrow morning we start bombing Baghdad. And they're going to a session there. This one is the meeting they were going to, and it's got the whole team in there. Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, General Scowcroft, National Security Advisor, and John Sununu, Chief of Staff, and myself. And we were the 6 or 7 guys who met with the President almost every day from August 1st, 1990 until the day of the air war started on January 17th of 1991. I call that the big jaws picture. They're all standing there with their jaws out ready to go to war. I thought, oh my God. But anyway, they're great, great Americans. This is Thanksgiving of 1990. We're starting to build up in the Saudi desert, and President Bush went there for Thanksgiving dinner. Ironically, in the middle of the dinner, we got a phone call from Margaret Thatcher. I took the call because he was in the middle of talking to the troops there at the table, and told her he would call her right back, which he did in just a few minutes. And she told him that she had been removed from office by her party and was no longer going to be Prime Minister of Great Britain. So that was kind of a personal blow because the two of them had been together on this from the very beginning. But her replacement was Prime Minister John Major, fairly low-key guy, not so well known in the United States, but a terrific friend of the President's, indeed a friend for the rest of his life. But that was the beginning of the military buildup when we had a few thousand troops there. This is a meeting with General Schwarzkopf, who was the leader of the group, and the President wanted to talk to him just about to reassure him where we were going and what his policies were and so forth. There's General Powell. This is on the last day, February 27. We'd been at war for approximately a month and a half at this point. We had spent a month primarily involved in ground actions against Baghdad and against other targets in in Iraq. And we started the ground war, and it only lasted 3 days, basically 100 hours. The ground war, the air war had done really such a good job that there were really they had no defenses against our ground forces who went in. And so we were having a meeting on this afternoon. This is in the Oval Office with the President. And the President said, he listened to the report on where we were, and he said, well, can I end it tonight, Colin? I don't want this to go on any longer than necessary. And Colin said, well, yes, but let me check with Schwarzkopf. And the President says, fine, use my telephone right here in the desk. And you notice that the cord goes down to a drawer on the front side of his desk and on the bottom. And I also notice it's not red. The red phone is a myth that Hollywood devised. Indeed, it's white, but it did go directly through to the general in the desert there between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And Colin asking me if he would be prepared for a ceasefire that day. And Schwarzkopf said, well, I needed a few more hours to deal with the tank group that's operating north of Basra, and then we're all set. Colin hung up the phone and reported that to the President. And he said, well, let's make 9 o'clock the end of the war. Call a ceasefire. And that's what we did. So that's the last day of the war for all practical purposes. And it was, and I like to show this slide. This was a victory celebration at the end of the war. And I was a little concerned about it as the press secretary because I didn't want people to think that it was just congratulatory or self-censored pride or that sort of thing. And that wasn't what the President had in mind. The fact is, he was looking all through the war for a way to end it. One of his principles was we ought to have first of all, we needed to have an exit strategy whenever we went to war. We ought to know before we went in some idea about how we're going to get out. And when we do, we ought to be able to say to the American people, it's over, we won, and the troops are coming home. And he kept saying during the war, he kept saying, what about something like on the decks of the Missouri? And he had been in World War II, and for him that was a very important point. When he saw the surrender on the decks of the USS Missouri ship, he knew it was over. And he says, I want a symbol like that the American people can see and they can define, and they know it's over. And every time he would mention the USS Missouri, Colin Powell would look at me and say, Marlin, we're going to have to build a ship out there in the desert. I said, I don't think so. But anyway, what they came up with was this parade, not a parade of machines and guns and tanks and military, but a parade of our troops. Because the president wanted to show it's over and the troops are coming home. And I want it now. And this was only a few weeks after we'd already started bringing home the troops. And so I think that's an important picture because it shows the military leader, General Schwarzkopf, offering a salute to the commander-in-chief and him accepting the salute, and the symbolism to the American people, as I've tried to articulate as many times as I could from the White House podium, was the end of the war. It was over and we were coming home. We had done what the UN resolution said we were supposed to do. I include this picture only because after it was all over, we went to church right across the street from the White House, and President Bush was a fairly religious man, not so much in public, but in privately he prayed daily and he went to church a lot. And I just think this was an important and kind of unseen part of the war, but nevertheless real. So with that, to wrap up the Desert Storm part, which is the center piece of the book, I want to just tell a few stories and then we'll take questions. Just because I do in the book have a large section of just stories about my friends. And some are better than others, but I want to start with this one because it features Don Wilson, who was another Abilene boy who went to high school with me. We were in the same class. He lived up here on Buckeye Street. His dad owned the printing shop here in Abilene, Schottinger Wilson Printing Company. And lo and behold, about 2 years after I went into the White House, he shows up. And he had gotten a job. The president appointed him the nation's historian. And actually, before that even, he had been director of the Eisenhower Library, one of the early directors, early in my public life anyway, back in the 70s. And so it turned out we had two Abilene boys there, so I took him in to talk to the president, and I said, we have some stories. The president liked to talk about football. He played football in college, and he loved those stories, and I told the president about beating Concordia once by 35 points. I was pretty pleased with that game, actually. The president wasn't sure I deserved the honor in this, but he enjoyed it anyway, and he always liked those discussions. This is my favorite picture. This is the Moscow summit in 1988, and one of the last summit meetings with Gorbachev before the end of the Cold War. And we were in the Moscow embassy, not the embassy itself, but the embassy residence where the ambassador lives, called Spaso House. And our CIA and others had checked it out, and there were bugs in every room. I mean, if you took a shower, you better be good because there was going to be pictures of it all over Moscow. And so in the lobby of the residence, actually, they built this little room, all lead. It can't be as big as maybe this little corner on this side of the door over to here, and it filled up with a table, as you can see, and there's the whole team, and we're sitting knee to knee. And so we're all touching each other. It was a very close relationship for those days, but that's where we would go in to discuss what we were going to talk about that day with Gorbachev and in the discussions. And theoretically, that would that the radiation beams that they tried to shoot through the walls, which carried I never understood this really, but they shoot radiation in, and then beams carry voices out, and we checked every window of the president's bedroom had radiation levels as high as you can believe for human beings. And I think Mrs. Reagan did not sleep too well in those nights, and neither did I, because you just don't know what's going on over there. But in any case, we moved in there every morning and had jungle music outside. So we all kidded each other about, we can't wait to get in the jungle. And once you went inside, then it was totally silent, and we were able to conduct our meetings. So there I'm opposite the president, and the vice president wasn't on that trip, so I was in pretend mode. And I figured, why not get a good seat here and pretend I'm the vice president? You know, what do I know? Anyway, this is the last day President Reagan was in office, which was unique for me because at this point I had been deputy press secretary to Reagan for 2 years. Then I joined Vice President Bush's staff. Then I went back to Reagan as his full press secretary for his last 2 years, and then all 4 of Bush's years. So I'd gone back to Reagan at this point on the last day of his administration, and President Bush had already invited me, he wanted to appoint me press secretary for his term. So I went in there that morning, January 20th, 1989, to say goodbye to President Reagan, and he was going around for the last time, and everything is cleaned off. The walls are clean, they've repainted the whole place. Nothing is there from the days of his presidency. And he just walked around and looked, and he went to his desk where he's standing right now, and it's still dark in the room. They didn't even have they had those lights on around the ceiling, but not lower lights. And he took out a notepad that he had placed there, and it had a picture of a turkey on it, one of those pre-printed turkeys, and it said, "Don't let the turkeys get you down." And he wrote a note to President Bush underneath it that just said, how proud he was of him and what a great job they had done together, and thank you, and put it back in the drawer. So then I went with President Reagan up to Capitol Hill for the inauguration. Bush was inaugurated, the new president, and I rode back down the hill to the White House with the new president, George Bush. Now I tell you that lengthy story only because that's my little niche in history, and I don't want to forget it even when anybody else does. So, but anyway, I went in with Bush because I wanted Bush to read the note and I'd see because I had seen Reagan write it. And President Bush went over to the desk, opened it up, and picked up the note and read it. And all he said was very quietly, he said, "What a sweet man." And Reagan was a sweet man, and Bush and he had become very, very close at the end of their 8 years. Now this is the Reagan sense of humor. He was a practical joker, and not in anything harmful or dangerous, but he just loved little things. Like if I made it a habit of going to sleep on Air Force One. As soon as I got on the plane, bam, I'm out. Because I know I might not sleep again for 3 days. I know it's going to be hell whenever I get to wherever we're going. And I wanted to get all the sleep I could. So the president saw this, and he started coming back, and he grabbed the photographer, and he'd say, "Come over here with me." And he would go up to where I'm having a snore there and say, Marlin, your president needs you. Wake up." And of course, I would wake up suitably embarrassed, and everybody in the plane was making fun of me. But anyway, he thought that was clever. The other thing Reagan loved was birthdays, his own and everybody else's. So here he's throwing a birthday party for me on Air Force One. And there aren't many of those in the history books either, so I was really living high that day. But he was fun to travel with and fun to be with. He was just a charming fellow. This is another typical joke, and I don't tell this very often, and I ask your forgiveness to use a slightly off-colored word. But the president was having his first press conference when I rejoined him as president in 1987. And the press were on him because of Iran-Contra, and they were all saying, oh, he's dead, he's going to be impeached, he's committed terrible crimes here, and it's all over, his presidency's gone. And they said, they said, why are you holding a press conference? I said, well, he wants to say he's seen the investigations, he's gone through it, he's going to make whatever changes, and we'll move forward. We've got other things to do. So the press was saying, he's going to resign. He can't survive this. It's all over for him. That thought had never entered his mind. So just before the press conference, and I was nervous as the devil, and I'm in my office, and we get to be about 10 minutes before we're supposed to start. I'm ready to go, and I get a phone call that says, the president wants to see you in the family quarters immediately. I thought, oh no, what's he going to do? Is this going to be some secret move or resignation or some terrible thing? So I rushed up to the family quarters. The usher met me in the lobby, took me in, and there he was standing there with Chief of Staff Howard Baker and the doctor and a couple other Secret Service agents. And he said, Marlin, I just wanted you to see this suit. What do you think about this? So I walked over to him, and he's wearing this brown suit. Of course, we all hated his old brown suits, but he loved that thing, so that's what he was wearing. And I said, true to form, oh, that's a great looking suit, Mr. President. You look terrific. And he said, no. What do you think of this tie? So I walked over closer. I got about this far from him. I looked at it, and I saw it was that tie tack he wanted me to see. Now, if you can't tell what that tie tack is, the president says, Marlin, what is this tie tack? I said, well, sir, it looks like a horse's ass. He said, that's it. And I'm thinking, no. The press is all going to interpret this as he's calling us a horse's ass. I said, Mr. President, I'm trying to think, how do I present this to him delicately? Because I know he's probably called me up there because he thought I would go crazy when I saw it. And I just said, Mr. President, I don't believe I would wear that tie tack. And he said, okay. And I said, I got to go give the press a 2-minute warning. I'll meet you at the bottom of the stairs in 2 minutes. He said, all right. So I left. What I really wanted to do was get the hell out of that room so that he could have time to come to his senses and take that tie tack off. Anyway, I went back in 2 minutes, and I met him at the bottom of the stairs. Nancy was on his arm. They were coming down together. I had no idea whether she knew this or not, had looked at it or not. And he gets to the bottom of the stairs, and he's still wearing it. And I said, okay, we're going to play this one straight. And I took him by, we're ready, Mr. President. We walked into the briefing. We did the entire press conference. And of course, in my judgment, I could just picture CBS News cameraman, like this fellow jumped back here in the back of the room, seeing that tie tack and zooming that camera in slowly all the way from the back of the East Room to that tie tack. And then I can imagine all of America raising up and saying, it's a horse's ass! None of that happened. None of that happened. The press never even noticed. The press conference was over. He did his 13 questions in a half an hour. Everybody said he did great. Iran-Contra was a thing of the past, and that was it. And he wore it 2 more times, and they still never saw it. I think he was disgusted that they never saw it. Anyway, it's now 12:30, and I promised to leave time for questions and answers. Maybe during the Q&A I can tell you my favorite Barbara Bush story, who was clearly the funniest lady to ever serve in the White House. Thank you all very much.
If anyone has a question, let go on.
I can probably shout this.
Yes, sir.
What's your favorite Barbara Bush story?
In 1992, we were getting ready to run for, the president was going to run for re-election, President Bush, and we were down in Houston at the big convention center there, and we'd been campaigning all day for state candidates and others, and I was just beat. And I wanted to go smoke a cigar and have a scotch. And but Mrs. Bush does not like smoking and doesn't like people who smoke cigars, and talked to me about it several times. So I didn't know what to do, and there was no bar around for scotch, so that was out too. So what I looked to find a room kind of like this with 40-foot ceilings and a lot of room and nobody around, and I said, I'm going to go back there and light a cigar. So I did. I walked down the hallway, and I lit my cigar, and lo and behold, down the hallway comes somebody I never imagined being there, George W., the oldest boy. This was before he became governor of Texas and before he became president. And he came down and he says, Marlin, you got another one of those cigars? I said, sure, George. I pulled it out, gave him one, and the two of us stood there smoking those cigars. And then, so we're just talking a little bit, and we looked up the hallway, and there comes another figure we never expected to see, Mrs. Barbara Bush. What in the world is she doing back in the back of this big coliseum by herself? Anyway, she came right down. George and I did exactly what a good son would do and a good staff person like me. We put those babies right in our suit pocket. And so I'm holding that thing with both fingers and trying to protect the ash. And she just takes her time, walks right up, never says a word, gets right in front of us and says, well, hi, boys, how are you? And I'm scared to death. I say nothing. And W says, we're fine, Mom, we're fine. And she says, okay. And she turns around, took us about 3 steps. And just as we thought we were home free, she turns around and says, and by the way, boys, your pants are on fire. I tell you, I pulled those cigars out of there immediately. Ashes going all over the place. I tell people it's 40 years later, I can still feel that hot spot on my leg, I'm telling you. Anyway, that's the story. Anyone else? Jerry's right here in my front row. I didn't even see him.
When are you going on Dancing with the Stars?
Yes, well, there are not too many ambitions in life that I'm willing to pass up, but that's one of them. I think Sean Spicer is doing fine, and I'll leave him the whole opportunity. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I don't mean to be indelicate, but with Ronald Reagan suffering Alzheimer's in the final years of his life, I've heard some people suggest that he was showing that in his final years as president. I never thought that. But
Yeah.
do you have any insight into that?
Yes, I don't believe that he did. I don't believe that at all. And here's the reason why. First of all, the doctors didn't diagnose it for 4 more years after he left the White House. I think it would have shown up dramatically if he had had it then. Secondly, there was no evidence of it that I could see. And in fact, the last day he was in office, he asked to do an interview with Mike Wallace for 60 minutes. And he did it because he knew I wasn't too high on Mike Wallace, but Nancy was, and she had talked him into doing this. And Mike Wallace was a pretty tough interviewer, for those of you who might remember him. And I said, oh, Mr. President, why take a chance here the last day you're in office? And he said, no, I want to do it. So he did, and he grilled the president for 45 minutes on every tough, nasty question he could possibly get. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Et cetera. And the president was perfect. He never stumbled, never had a bad moment. So I didn't see it, and I don't think it was there then. But it was about 4 years later, they were out riding horses in the mountains at his ranch. And they got back, and Nancy called the doctor over, the physician who was always with them anyway, and said, now look at him. This is the problem. We were out there riding, and he didn't know exactly where we were. He didn't recognize the mountain or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but something like that. And that was the first indication they did. And then the New York Times put a group of doctors headed by a medical man from New York on the story, and they did a full-page analysis and talked to every doctor and every Alzheimer's specialist they could get their hands on. And the conclusion of all of them was that he had not been suffering it when he was in the White House, and probably not for a couple of years after that. So I don't believe it's true.
Thank you.
Any others? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, this is a little bit on the personal side, but I was interested in seeing your picture of Don Wilson.
Yes.
He grew up in Clay Center, and I was in high school, and I was his babysitter for a couple of years.
Oh, really? Really?
And so I was very proud to see him go as far as he did with the government and the National Archives. I thought it was awesome. Thank you for including
Yeah,
this picture.
he did. He's a good fellow, and his mother's still alive in Clay Center. Yeah. Yeah. But he was a good friend, and I still see him often. He lives down in South Carolina. Yeah, and he actually, at the end of his life, had been the director of about 5 presidential libraries, as well as the nation's historian. He had a great career. Yes, sir.
What was one of the toughest press conferences you ever had?
Well, the toughest press conference or press briefing even every day is always the one where you don't know the answers. And that's just because you haven't done your homework for some reason, you know. I used to believe, well, first of all, you can usually predict what the questions are going to be from the press corps because they're tied to the issues of the day. So you can read the morning's paper and you know the top 5 stories that they're caring about when they get to me, because they want a presidential response from what they're reading. And so I used to believe that if I knew 5 basic facts about the top 5 stories of the day, I was smarter than they were. And that usually proved to be true. And the worst questions for me were somebody like Sarah McClendon of the El Paso Times, who would say, "Mr. Marlin, when are they going to sign off on the El Paso sewage treatment plant?" I don't know, Sarah, but I'll find that out for you. The best I could do. But there were some tough press conferences during the war. The toughest one, I think, was during Saddam Hussein had a lot of failures in many ways, but he was kind of a master of subterfuge and hiding things. He had cardboard cutouts of airplanes he parked in people's driveways, and cutouts of tanks he would put out in the desert to try to draw us into them. And we blew up a command center one night, and he went in the next morning and planted milk factory signs all over the building and over the rubble. And he brought in all the former employees with the coveralls, and it said on the back, Baghdad Milk Factory. So the press the next morning said, "Marlin, why are you blowing up Baby's Milk Factory here and killing civilians and so forth?" That was tough. Those were tough. And I wrote a statement that I wanted to read about America and how we felt about war and how we felt about civilians and children and so forth. And that I had checked with CIA and Pentagon and everybody, and I was assured, first of all, that this was not a milk factory. And any right-thinking human being who saw the coveralls that said, in English, "baby factory" on it, knew it was not real. But the military people were pretty reluctant to have me say that, but I did it anyway. But that was tough because it was sad. And interestingly enough, the night before we started the war, we had a meeting in the president's private office there that was in that picture. And as the meeting was closing, General Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is a step above General Schwarzkopf, the highest ranking military man. By the way, the former rank of our president at Kansas State University, Richard Myers, was also chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But anyway, Colin said, "Marlin, can I see you for a minute after this meeting?" I said, "Sure." So he came down to my office, which is right next to the Oval Office, and he closed the door and he said, I just wanted to say one thing, and that is that when you sit through these briefings, things look pretty clean. You're seeing us move around lines and move around men and say, here's the tank and here's stuff. And he said, but it's not going to be clean tomorrow. And he said, Saddam is saying we're going to bring on body bags, and he's saying he's going to light fires in the oil in the desert trenches, and we're going to burn up 10,000 Americans. And he says, I don't think any of that's going to happen, but I can't tell you it won't. I can't tell you that there won't be a lot of deaths. So you need to spend the night thinking about what you're going to say, because you need to be representing America's interest here. And fortunately, it never happened, but it was scary. So we got through it. There were almost no casualties in that first days of the war. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I have a little bit of a story about you, and then that leads into my question.
Well, did I do the right thing?
Yes.
Oh.
In this room, I'm an Abilene graduate, and in this room when I was in 8th grade, a group of students, we won State History Day. And so we were given a trip to go to Washington, D.C., and you were the press secretary for George Bush at the time. And you set up a tour of the White House for us, for the group from Abilene. And when I met you there, we had a conversation about being press secretary and how important it was. And because of your influence, I also went to Kansas State University and graduated from the School of Journalism.
Oh, thank you. That's terrific.
So that leads me to my questions. So what do you think about the state of journalism today?
I knew this was too good to be true. I'm uncertain, for one thing. I mean, I have some ambivalent attitudes because journalism, I think, today represents a lot of different places and people and statuses, frankly. If you look at journalism as reflected by the New York Times and the Washington Post and national television news, what you see is a group of journalists that have decided to become partisan politically. They've decided that it's okay for journalists to have a political belief, not just, it's always okay for them to have a belief, but that they should represent that belief in their reporting. And I don't think that works. I think that's what causes a lot of the division in America. People see that in the print and they see it in the press and think that that's okay, or they react violently to it. People react violently to news that they know is prejudice, that they know is violent in one way or another, and they react accordingly. On the other hand, there is still a large segment of the press that believe in honesty and objective reporting and trying to represent the truth as best they can. And that's the press that I studied and I believe in. And I'd like to see us return to that. I don't know that we will. But I think at this point, journalism is split, not unlike the country is split in terms of this whole question of what's appropriate political behavior. I would say that I saw Tim Moran a minute ago, the editor of the Abilene paper. And I must say that he's got 3 writers there on that paper that I think are really outstanding. Gene Bowers and Miss Hageman and Tim himself. And they write a lot of good stuff. I'm not here to pass judgment on it, but I think I like what they've done to the paper here. I guess maybe we better call an end to this and do books and that sort of thing. Is that right, Diane?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate it.